The golden champagne bubbled in crystal flutes as Robert Callahan checked the small blue velvet case in the inside pocket of his tuxedo for the 5th time. His heart hammered against his ribs, but not with the usual nervousness of a marriage proposal. There was something different about that anxiety, something he preferred not to name as he watched Rachel Winters circulate through the ballroom of the Grand Palais Hotel in Chicago, her red dress contrasting with the neutral tones of the elegant decor, celebrating 25 years of Callahan and Associates. Rachel was everything Adriana wasn't: young, vibrant, always willing to accompany him to corporate events without questioning the overtime or last-minute trips. At 28, she brought an energy Robert felt he had lost somewhere between his 47 years and 18 years of marriage. Adriana had become a silent shadow in her own home, always with that tired look that made him feel guilty for crimes he didn't even know he'd committed. The divorce had been underway for 3 months. The papers were served on a cold March morning when Adriana was making coffee in the kitchen of that Lincoln Park house he had bought to impress her 2 decades ago. She didn't even cry, just signed with trembling hands and left without a word. Since then they communicated only through lawyers, and Robert slept soundly, knowing he would soon be free to start anew. The party was perfect. 200 guests, including the company's key partners, investors and executives from Chicago's largest corporations. The band played soft jazz as waiters circulated with trays of canapés and imported champagne. Robert had planned every detail of that night, not just as a company celebration, but as the perfect stage for his big announcement. Everyone would see that Robert Callahan was not a finished man, but someone reborn, starting over, conquering. Marcus Fitzgerald, his minority partner and best friend since college, approached with 2 glasses in hand and a crooked smile on his tanned face. "Are you sure about this, Robert?" Marcus handed him a glass, his blue eyes serious behind the casual expression. "I mean, here, now, in front of everyone." "That's exactly why it has to be here." Robert took the drink and took a long swallow. "I want everyone to see that I'm happy, that I made the right choice. Adriana almost destroyed me with her constant sadness, that way she had of making me feel like I was never enough." "Adriana was always good to you, man." Marcus shook his head. "She built half of this company by your side, took care of your mother when she was sick, made a home for you. And she became bitter in the process." Robert felt the familiar irritation rise in his throat. "You don't understand because Karen is different. Rachel makes me feel alive again." Marcus opened his mouth to reply, but was interrupted when Rachel materialized beside them, her floral perfume filling the space. She linked her arm through Robert's with a possessive familiarity. "What are you 2 talking about with those serious faces?" She tilted her head, her blonde curls falling over one shoulder. "This is a party, gentlemen." Robert kissed her forehead, feeling the curious glances of several guests. Let them look, let them comment. Soon everyone would understand. "Actually," Robert cleared his throat, "I think it's time for the official speech." Rachel's green eyes widened, a mix of surprise and excitement. She didn't know exactly what he was planning, but he had hinted that this night would be special. Robert felt a wave of satisfaction seeing her reaction. He walked to the small stage where the band was playing, the velvet case burning in his pocket like a promise. The band leader noticed his approach and gradually faded the music until only a soft murmur filled the ballroom. 200 pairs of eyes turned in his direction. "Good evening, everyone." Robert took the microphone, his voice echoing through the speakers. "First, I want to thank each of you for being here to celebrate 25 years of Callahan and Associates. This is not just a professional milestone, but a personal one." Polite applause filled the ballroom. Robert searched for Rachel in the sea of faces, finding her near the dance floor, her hands clasped against her chest. You all know I've been through significant changes recently. He paused, choosing his words. Changes that have allowed me to rediscover who I truly am, what truly matters, and that journey has led me to someone very special. The ballroom fell so silent that Robert could hear his own breathing amplified by the microphone. He stepped down from the stage, his Italian shoes tapping against the marble floor as he walked towards Rachel. Guests moved aside, creating a natural aisle between them. Rachel covered her mouth with her hands, tears already shining in her eyes. Robert felt his own chest tighten, not from emotion, but from determination. This was real. This was his new beginning. When he was just 3 steps away from her, Robert knelt. The ballroom erupted in muffled murmurs and exclamations of surprise. He took the case from his pocket, opening it to reveal a diamond ring that had cost more than he should have spent. Rachel Winters. His voice sounded firm through the microphone he still held in his other hand. You brought light back into my life when I was lost in darkness. You reminded me what it feels like to be alive, desired, understood. Will you make me the happiest man in this city and marry me? Rachel was openly weeping now, nodding her head before she could even form words. Yes, yes, I will. She extended her trembling hand and Robert slid the ring onto her finger, feeling the adrenaline of victory surge through his veins. He stood and pulled her into a deep kiss as the ballroom erupted in applause and whistles. It was perfect. Everything was going exactly as planned, except for the sudden shift in atmosphere. The applause began to die down unevenly, as if someone were turning off speakers one by one. Robert pulled away from Rachel, confused, and followed the collective gaze of the guests towards the main entrance of the ballroom. The massive double oak doors had opened without him noticing. There, framed by the light of the hallway behind her, stood Adriana. But not the Adriana he knew, that muted, tired woman who had signed the divorce papers without a fight. This Adriana wore a black, high-fashion gown that embraced every curve of her slender body, the fabric subtly shimmering under the crystal chandeliers. Her dark brown hair, which she always wore in a simple bun, fell in elegant waves over her shoulders. The dark eyes Robert thought had lost all light now gleamed with something he couldn't identify, and beside her, with a possessive hand at the small of her back, stood Alexander Montgomery. The ballroom fell completely silent. Everyone in Chicago knew that name. Alexander Montgomery wasn't just a billionaire, he was the billionaire. The man who had built a real estate empire from nothing and now controlled half of the city's commercial buildings. His presence at social events was rare and always significant. Robert's stomach dropped. Alexander Montgomery moved through the ballroom as if the very air bowed to his passage. Tall, broad-shouldered, with aristocratic features marked by a strong jawline, he commanded attention without needing to demand it. His charcoal grey suit was clearly custom-made, probably Italian, and worth more than most of the cars parked in the hotel's underground garage. But it wasn't the clothing that made people instinctively step aside, creating a wide path as he and Adriana advanced towards the center of the ballroom. It was the raw power that radiated from every calculated movement, every penetrating gaze from his steel-colored eyes. Robert remained frozen beside Rachel, the microphone still in his now sweating hand, the weight of the ring he had just placed on her finger transforming into invisible shackles. His brain struggled to process the scene before him. Adriana and Alexander Montgomery, together, here, at his company's party. It had to be a mistake, an elaborate coincidence his bewildered brain couldn't yet decipher. Marcus appeared beside him, his voice low and tense. "Robert, did you know about this? Did you have any idea she knew Montgomery?" Robert shook his head mechanically, unable to form words. His throat had turned to sandpaper. Adriana stopped approximately 10 meters from the small stage, her posture erect and confident in a way Robert had never seen in their 18 years of marriage. That woman who looked at him with a serene and slightly amused expression was not the same one who had signed the divorce papers with trembling hands. There was something different in her eyes, a spark of determination that suddenly made him feel small at his own event. Alexander stepped forward, and the ballroom seemed to shrink around him. When he spoke, his grave voice cut through the silence like a sharp blade. "I apologize for the interruption." His tone carried not a trace of apology. "But I believe this is the perfect moment to make an announcement that will affect everyone present." Robert finally found his voice, though it sounded strangled even through the microphone. "Montgomery, with all due respect, this is a private event for my company. I don't recall inviting you." A cold smile curled Alexander's lips, not reaching his eyes. "Technically, Callahan, it's no longer just your company." He gestured elegantly towards Adriana. "I'd like to introduce my partner in several ventures and the newest majority shareholder of Callahan and Associates, though I believe you already know each other intimately." The ballroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Rachel clutched Robert's arm hard enough to leave marks, her nails digging into the fabric of his tuxedo. Robert felt the floor sway beneath his feet, as if the Italian marble had turned to jelly. "This is ridiculous." He forced a laugh that sounded hysterical even to his own ears. "Adriana doesn't have the capital to buy a pen in this company, much less shares." Adriana finally spoke, and her voice was melodious and firm, filling the space with an authority Robert had never heard from her. "You are correct in one aspect, Robert. I didn't have my own capital, but you forget that my grandmother, Clara, passed away 4 months ago." She paused, letting the words sink in. "The inheritance you assumed would be insignificant. The old house in Lake Forest that you said would barely cover her debts was actually on land worth $8 million. Montgomery Properties was interested in the area for a new commercial development." Robert felt the blood drain from his face. Adriana's grandmother's house. He had barely paid attention when she mentioned the inheritance, too busy with the divorce proceedings and his plans with Rachel. Adriana had handled everything herself, and he had simply assumed it would be irrelevant. Alexander continued, his hand moving to Adriana's waist in a gesture that seemed rehearsed for maximum impact. "Adriana approached me 3 months ago with a business proposition. She had a valuable asset and inside information about a company I'd been interested in for some time. Callahan and Associates has excellent commercial client contracts that align perfectly with my real estate interests." He smiled, and there was something predatory in that expression. "She sold me the land, we invested together in some other lucrative opportunities, and with the resulting capital, we acquired 35% of your company's shares from investors who were eager to sell. Apparently there have been concerns about leadership stability recently." Marcus swore under his breath beside Robert. 35%. Robert owned 40%, Marcus had 20%, and the rest was divided among smaller investors. If Adriana had 35%, she wasn't just a significant shareholder, she had real decision-making power. With the right alliance, she could block any major decision Robert tried to make. "This is impossible." Robert felt rage replace shock, rising in his throat like bile. "You can't just show up and buy parts of my company without me knowing." "Actually, I can, and I did." Adriana tilted her head slightly, and there was something soft in her expression that was more devastating than any anger could be. All transactions were completely legal and transparent. The investors had every right to sell their shares. You were so busy with your personal life that you didn't even notice when Jeremy Patterson started asking questions 2 weeks ago, trying to warn you that something was happening. Robert vaguely remembered Jeremy, one of the smaller investors, trying to schedule a meeting. He had cancelled 3 times, too focused on planning that perfect night, on ensuring every detail of the proposal was flawless. Rachel tugged at his arm, her voice sharp and almost desperate. "Robert, do something. She can't do this." But Robert was beyond acting. He watched, paralyzed, as his reality crumbled piece by piece. Guests whispered among themselves, some with phones already in hand, no doubt sending messages about the unfolding drama. Tomorrow, all of Chicago would know. The entire business community would be talking about how Robert Callahan had been humiliated at his own anniversary party, how his ex-wife had returned with one of the city's most powerful men by her side. Alexander took another step forward, his words measured and precise. "There's one more thing." He waited until he had everyone's full attention in the ballroom. "Adriana and I are engaged. We'll be married next month in a private ceremony in Napa Valley." The final bomb. Rachel let out a strangled sound, half sob, half hysterical laugh. Marcus swore again, louder this time, and Robert simply stood there, the microphone slipping from his powerless fingers and falling to the floor with an amplified thud that echoed through the sound system. Adriana finally looked directly at him, and in that moment, Robert saw everything he had lost. Not just a wife, but a partner, an ally, someone who had loved him enough to remain silent while she was neglected, who had built a life by his side only to see it shattered. And now that same woman stood before him, transformed and powerful, about to take everything he valued. Happy anniversary. "Callahan and Associates." Alexander raised a glass that a waiter had quickly provided. "I look forward to a long and productive partnership from now on." Some guests, unsure of the protocol for the bizarre situation, raised their glasses in response. Others remained motionless, watching Robert with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. The man, who minutes earlier had been at the peak of his personal triumph, was now the center of a public disaster he could not control. And as Alexander and Adriana turned to circulate the ballroom, greeting guests who seemed magnetically drawn to their power and drama, Robert remained frozen beside Rachel, the engagement ring gleaming mockingly on her finger, a costly reminder of how terribly wrong everything had gone. The women's restroom at the Grand Palais Hotel offered a temporary refuge from the chaos that had erupted in the ballroom. Rachel locked herself in one of the marble stalls, her hands trembling as she furiously typed on her cell phone, trying to process what she had just witnessed. The engagement ring seemed to weigh tons on her finger, a symbol that just minutes ago represented victory and now felt like a costly mistake. Outside, she could hear other women coming and going, their voices excitedly whispering about the drama that had unfolded. Rachel pressed her hand against her mouth, trying to stifle a sob. This was not how that night was supposed to end. Robert had promised her that everything was settled, that the divorce was just a formality, that Adriana had given up without a fight. He had never mentioned valuable land, significant inheritances, or connections to billionaires. The restroom door opened again, and Rachel heard the unmistakable sound of expensive heels on the marble floor. A female voice she recognized as Jennifer Walsh's, wife of one of the key investors, echoed through the space. "Did you see his face? I thought Robert was going to faint right there." "I always knew he was an idiot," another voice replied, probably Catherine Lynn, the CEO of a consulting firm. "But to dump Adriana like that." The woman literally created half of the company's operating systems while he was busy networking on golf courses. And that girl Rachel, what an awkward situation. She really thought she'd be the new Mrs. Callahan, and found out he doesn't even own the company anymore. Rachel felt the blood boil in her cheeks. She squeezed the phone so hard her fingers turned white. She wanted to scream that they didn't understand, that Robert loved her, that this was just a temporary setback. But the words caught in her throat, because a part of her, a small and cruel part, whispered that perhaps they were right. Meanwhile, in the main ballroom, Robert was cornered near the bar by Marcus, who had practically dragged him away from the curious stares of the guests. The party continued around them, but the mood had completely shifted. Conversations were animated not by celebration, but by the fresh gossip that had just landed in their laps. "You need to get out of here," Marcus said quietly, his serious blue eyes sweeping the room. "Every second you stay is more ammunition for the vultures. Tomorrow, this will be on all the city's business blogs." Robert took a long swallow of the whiskey he had ordered, the liquid burning his throat in a way that was almost welcome. Any sensation was better than the icy emptiness that had settled in his chest since Adriana had walked through those doors. "How did she do this?" Robert's voice came out hoarse. 18 years, Marcus. 18 years married to that woman, and I had no idea she was capable of something like this. She was always so passive, so compliant, or you never paid enough attention to notice who she really was. Marcus signaled the bartender for another round. "Adriana was always brilliant, you know that. She had a master's in business administration when you met. She's the one who developed the entire client management system we use to this day. You just assumed that because she was quiet, she was weak." Robert wanted to argue, to defend himself, but Marcus's words cut too close to the truth. He thought of all the times Adriana had made suggestions about the company, and he had waved them off distractedly, assuming he knew better. All the nights she had stayed up reviewing contracts while he was dining with clients, or, for the past 2 years, with Rachel. Across the ballroom, Adriana was surrounded by a group of executives, all clearly eager to make connections with Alexander Montgomery's new partner. She smiled gracefully, accepted business cards, conversed with an ease Robert had never seen in her. Alexander remained close, not possessive, but present, his hand occasionally touching her arm or back in gestures that spoke of intimacy. Robert felt a pang of something he refused to name as jealousy. He had been the one to leave Adriana. He had chosen Rachel, had signed the divorce papers without hesitation. He had no right to feel betrayed seeing her with another man, especially a man who clearly could offer everything he had never thought to give. "We need to do some damage control," Marcus continued, pulling Robert back into the conversation. "First thing tomorrow morning, we review all contracts and shareholder agreements. We need to know exactly how much power Adriana and Montgomery have and what our options are." "Our options?" Robert laughed bitterly. "You heard the man. They have 35%, with some of the smaller investors on their side. They can block any major decision I try to make. Callahan and Associates is no longer mine." "It's still your company," Marcus insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "You still have the largest individual percentage of shares. That counts for something." But both knew it wasn't true. In corporate matters, perception was everything, and the perception now was that Robert Callahan had lost control. Investors would see instability, clients would start questioning, competitors would smell blood in the water, and all because he had been arrogant enough to think he could discard his wife as if she were irrelevant. Jennifer Walsh approached them, her expression carefully neutral, though Robert could see the curiosity burning in her eyes. "Robert, Marcus," she greeted both with nods. "What an interesting night. I was just talking with Adriana and Mr. Montgomery. They mentioned they plan to bring in some external consultants to evaluate the company's operational efficiency. It seems ambitious plans are ahead." Marcus choked on his drink. Robert felt a new wave of anger mixed with panic. External consultants, they can't just walk in and start making changes without board approval. Jennifer tilted her head, her smile polite but distant. "Well, according to Mr. Montgomery, Adriana technically has the right to request operational reviews as a majority shareholder. Something about transparency clauses in the original investment agreements." She paused, savoring the moment. "But I'm sure you're familiar with all those details, Robert. After all, it's your company." She walked away before he could reply, leaving a tense silence between the two men. Robert watched her join the group around Adriana and Alexander, being welcomed with warm smiles. The shift in power in the ballroom was palpable. People gravitated towards the new center of influence, and that center was no longer Robert Callahan. Rachel finally emerged from the restroom, her eyes slightly red but her makeup restored. She located Robert at the bar and crossed the ballroom towards him, ignoring the stares that followed her. When she reached his side, her voice was low but tense. "We need to talk, in private." Marcus shot Robert a look, something between sympathy and warning, before discreetly stepping away. Robert followed Rachel to a side corridor that led to the hotel's smaller conference rooms, away from the party that had turned into his worst nightmare. Once they were alone, Rachel turned to him, and Robert saw fear in her green eyes for the first time since they had met. "Robert, what's going to happen now? With the company, with us, with everything?" He wanted to have answers, wanted to reassure her with the confidence he had displayed when he planned that disastrous night. But all he could do was shake his head, feeling the weight of 25 years of building crumbling around him. "I don't know," he admitted, and the raw honesty of those words seemed more devastating than any comforting lie could be. "I really don't know." Rachel looked at the ring on her finger, the diamond catching the corridor light and casting small rainbows against the wall. For a moment, Robert thought she would take it off, return it as a symbol of promises that now seemed hollow. But she merely closed her hand into a fist, hiding the jewel, and when she looked at him again, there was determination mixed with the fear. "Then we'll figure it out. Together. You're not alone in this, Robert." But as the sounds of the party continued to echo down the corridor, Robert couldn't help but feel that he was, indeed, completely alone, surrounded by the wreckage of choices he had made without considering the consequences. And somewhere in that ballroom, Adriana was redrawing the map of his life, proving that the woman he had discarded was far more powerful than he had ever imagined. The following morning brought with it a hangover that had nothing to do with the champagne Robert had consumed. He woke in the executive suite of the Grand Palais Hotel itself, unable to face the empty house in Lincoln Park that still carried ghosts of a life that no longer existed. Rachel slept beside him, curled in the white Egyptian cotton sheets, but even her presence couldn't ward off the weight pressing on his chest. The phone vibrated incessantly on the bedside table. Robert picked it up with reluctant fingers, his eyes burning from lack of sleep. The bright screen displayed a deluge of notifications, emails, text messages, news alerts. With a tight stomach, he opened the first news link. Chicago business drama. Callahan humiliated at his own party as ex-wife returns with Montgomery. The headline screamed in bold letters in the Chicago Business Tribune. Below, there were photos someone had managed to capture the night before. Adriana dazzling beside Alexander, and another of Robert kneeling before Rachel moments before everything fell apart. The article detailed every embarrassing moment with cruel precision. Robert threw the phone back onto the table, pressing the palms of his hands against his eyes. How had everything gone so terribly wrong? Just 24 hours ago, he was in control, about to start a brilliant new chapter. Now he was the protagonist of a business cautionary tale that would be told in boardrooms for years. Rachel stirred beside him, her green eyes slowly blinking open. For a brief moment, she seemed disoriented. Then the reality of the previous night clearly returned because her expression hardened. "It's already online, isn't it?" Her voice was hoarse from sleep and tears shed in the early hours of the morning. "Everywhere," Robert confirmed bitterly. "Congratulations, you're engaged to the most humiliated man in Chicago." Rachel sat up, pulling the sheets around her body like a shield. Something in her face had changed overnight, a hardness Robert hadn't noticed before. "You told me everything was settled, that the divorce was amicable, that Adriana had moved on." You didn't mention she was a strategic genius waiting for the right moment to destroy you. I didn't know! Robert felt frustration explode. Do you think I would have proposed in public if I knew she was planning this? 18 years, Rachel. She was my wife for 18 years and never showed that kind of calculated cruelty. Or maybe you never paid enough attention to notice, Rachel replied, echoing the words Marcus had said the previous night. People don't stay quiet forever, Robert, especially when they're betrayed and discarded. The truth in those words cut deeper than Robert wanted to admit. He got out of bed, walking to the panoramic window that offered a spectacular view of the Chicago skyline. Below, the city was waking up, millions of people starting their days, oblivious to the personal drama that had consumed his life. But in the office towers that dotted the urban landscape, Robert knew his name was being discussed, his reputation being dissected in coffee conversations and morning meetings. Rachel's phone also began to vibrate. She checked the screen, and her expression grew even tenser. "My mother," she said softly, "and my sister, and apparently half of my college friends. Everyone saw the news." Robert closed his eyes, adding another layer of guilt to the pile he already carried. Rachel hadn't asked for this. She had trusted him when he said everything would be fine, that they would start a life together free of complications. And now she was caught in a public scandal that would tarnish her own reputation by association. A sharp knock on the door made them jump. Robert quickly pulled on a t-shirt and pants, opening it to find Marcus on the other side, holding 2 cups of coffee and a grim expression. "We need to talk. Now." Marcus entered without waiting for an invitation, his eyes quickly assessing Rachel before turning back to Robert. Alone, preferably. Rachel understood the cue, getting up with dignity despite being wrapped only in a sheet. "I'm going to shower. Call me when you're done saving what's left of the empire." There was bitterness in her voice as she disappeared into the marble bathroom. Marcus waited until he heard the shower running before speaking. "I received calls from 3 of our biggest clients this morning. 3, Robert. Before 8 o'clock even." He handed Robert one of the coffees, which Robert accepted with trembling hands. "All wanting clarifications about the company's leadership structure. Read. They are considering jumping ship before it sinks." "Already? That quickly? You underestimate the speed of gossip in business circles, and it doesn't help that Montgomery apparently spent the morning making strategic calls." Marcus pulled out his own phone, showing a series of emails. "He's inviting our key clients to synergy exploration meetings between his commercial properties and their businesses. Basically, offering alternatives should they decide that Callahan and Associates is no longer reliable." Robert felt the coffee sour in his stomach. Montgomery wasn't just humiliating him personally, he was systematically dismantling his company, client by client, relationship by relationship. "This is war," he said softly. "No, this is business," Marcus corrected. "And Adriana and Montgomery are playing at a level you clearly underestimated. The question now is, how do we respond?" Robert sank onto the elegant suite sofa, his mind racing through possibilities. He could try to counterattack, make his own calls, appeal to old loyalties. But against the combined power of Adriana, who knew every internal aspect of the company, and Montgomery, whose resources were virtually limitless, it seemed like a lost battle before it even began. "We need a lawyer," Robert finally said. "The best corporate attorney we can find. If they bought these shares through some questionable legal maneuver, maybe we can contest it." Marcus shook his head slowly. "I already consulted Thompson this morning. He reviewed all the documentation we could access. It's all clean, Robert. Adriana and Montgomery did everything by the book. In fact, they used the very clauses you yourself signed years ago when you structured the initial investment agreement. Ironically, you created the tools of your own destruction. The weight of that revelation settled over Robert like a tombstone. He had been defeated not through cheating or illegal manipulation, but through his own carelessness, his own arrogance in assuming he would always be in control. A new knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Marcus opened it to reveal a hotel messenger holding a thick, cream-colored envelope. "Delivery for Mr. Robert Callahan." Marcus signed for it and closed the door, turning the envelope in his hands. The embossed logo in the upper corner identified it as being from the law firm Whitmore and Associates, one of Chicago's most prestigious. And, Robert remembered with a cold clench in his chest, the same firm Montgomery used for his corporate transactions. "Do you want me to open it?" Marcus offered. Robert shook his head, reaching out. Whatever it was, he needed to face it. He tore open the envelope and pulled out several carefully stapled documents. The header was formal and to the point. Corporate Restructuring Proposal, Callahan and Associates. As his eyes scanned the pages, the reality of the situation crystallized with brutal clarity. Adriana and Montgomery weren't just satisfied with publicly humiliating him. They had a complete plan to reshape the company, a plan that involved bringing in external consultants, reviewing all existing contracts, and fundamentally, removing Robert from daily operational decisions while keeping him as a representative figure with drastically reduced authority. "They want to turn me into a puppet," Robert said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Keep my name on the door while Adriana and Montgomery control everything." Marcus read over Robert's shoulder, letting out a low whistle. "There's an alternative here. They're offering to buy your remaining shares for a sum that I admit is generous. You would walk away rich, but completely out of the company you built." Robert looked at the numbers. $42 million, more money than most people saw in a lifetime. Enough to start fresh, invest in new ventures, maintain the lifestyle he had grown accustomed to. But it would also mean admitting complete defeat, handing over Callahan and Associates, the legacy he had spent 25 years building, to the woman he had so casually discarded. The shower stopped. Rachel would emerge soon, expecting answers, expecting him to have a plan to fix the disaster their lives had become. And Robert realized with painful clarity that he had no answers. For the first time in his adult life, he was completely out of his depth, playing a game whose rules he didn't understand against opponents who had studied his every weakness. Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder, a rare gesture of physical solidarity from his usually reserved partner. "You have 72 hours to respond to the proposal. After that, they'll take it to the board and force a vote. With the shares they control and the alliances they've probably already built, you're going to lose that vote." Robert nodded mechanically, his eyes still fixed on the documents that represented the end of everything he had worked for. Outside the window, Chicago continued its morning dance, indifferent to the human drama unfolding on the 23rd floor of the Grand Palais Hotel. And somewhere in the city, perhaps in an even more luxurious suite, Adriana was probably sipping her coffee, planning her next move, proving that the quiet, complacent woman Robert thought he knew had never truly existed. The afternoon poured through the window of the Whitmore and Associates law office with a golden light that contrasted cruelly with Robert's grim mood. He was seated in a leather chair that likely cost more than most people's monthly salary, watching Gregory Whitmore meticulously examine the documents spread across the mahogany table. The lawyer, a man in his 60s, with perfectly coiffed grey hair and gold-rimmed glasses, had that carefully neutral expression that expensive professionals cultivate when dealing with desperate clients. Marcus stood beside Robert, his legs crossed and fingers impatiently tapping on the arm of the chair. Rachel had stayed at the hotel, claiming a migraine, though Robert suspected she simply couldn't face the reality of what their lives had become anymore. In the 3 days since the disastrous party, she had grown increasingly distant, her phone constantly vibrating with messages from friends and family, who undoubtedly had opinions on his embarrassing situation. "Mr. Callahan," Gregory finally spoke, removing his glasses and cleaning them with a silk handkerchief. "I'm going to be frank, because that's what you're paying me $400 an hour for. Legalmente, you have no grounds to contest the share acquisition. Ms. Callahan, pardon me, Ms. Montgomery soon, and Mr. Montgomery conducted all transactions within the bounds of the law. In fact, they were meticulously careful to ensure every step was irreproachable." Robert felt his stomach sink even further, though he already knew that would be the answer. Still, part of him had clung to the hope that an expensive lawyer would find some legal loophole, some technicality that could save his crumbling empire. "So I'm completely out of options." His voice sounded defeated even to his own ears. Gregory replaced his glasses, his grey eyes assessing Robert with a mixture of professionalism and something that might have been pity. "You have options, but none of them are particularly attractive. First option, accept the buyout offer. $42 million is genuinely generous given the circumstances. You would walk away financially comfortable and free to start a new venture without the baggage of Callahan and Associates." "And the second option," Marcus interjected when Robert remained silent. "Remain as a minority shareholder and accept the reduced role they're proposing. You would maintain a nominal presence in the company, continue receiving dividends, but lose operational control. Essentially, you would become a well-paid consultant with no real authority." Robert stood up abruptly, walking to the window that offered a panoramic view of Chicago's financial district. Below, tiny people moved along the sidewalks, pursuing their own dreams and ambitions, oblivious to the drama unfolding on the 32nd floor. A week ago, he had looked out the window of his own office with a sense of mastery, feeling lord of all he surveyed. Now, everything felt fragile and temporary. "There's a third option," Gregory continued, his voice cautious. "You could try to build alliances with other shareholders, convince them that Montgomery and Ms. Callahan represent a threat to the company's stability. If you could rally enough support, you might block their restructuring initiatives." A spark of hope ignited in Robert's chest. He turned from the glass, facing the lawyer. Would that work? Realistically? Gregory exchanged a meaningful glance with Marcus before responding. "Realistically, it's an uphill battle. Montgomery has virtually limitless resources and an impeccable reputation in the business community. Your ex-wife has inside knowledge of the company and relationships with many of the key employees who are likely loyal to her. You, on the other hand," he paused delicately, "face a considerable public relations problem right now." The understatement was kind. Robert had seen the headlines continue in the following days. Every business blog, every social gossip column, every online discussion forum had an opinion on the man who had humiliated his loyal wife only to be torn apart by her in spectacular retaliation. The narrative had been established, and he was the villain. Marcus stood up as well, joining Robert near the window. "What if we offered a compromise? Something between selling out completely and maintaining the status quo. Robert keeps some operational control in exchange for granting them a greater say in strategic decisions." "You could try," Gregory admitted, "but based on the tone of the documents they sent, I don't believe Montgomery and Ms. Callahan are interested in compromises. They want total control, or they want Robert out completely. It's a power play, not a negotiation." Robert's phone vibrated in his pocket. He ignored it, as he had ignored most calls in recent days. But Marcus's device also began to ring, and then Gregory's desk phone. The three men exchanged worried glances before checking their screens simultaneously. Robert felt his blood run cold. It was a news alert from the Chicago Business Tribune, the headline flashing in urgent red letters: Exclusive, Adriana Montgomery announces merger between Callahan and Associates and Montgomery Properties. New era for traditional Chicago firm. Merger? Robert practically yelled, opening the article with trembling fingers. They can't do a merger without board approval. Marcus read over his shoulder, his face paling with each paragraph. Apparently, they've already secured the votes. Jensen and Yamamoto from the smaller investors have already signed in support. With Adriana and Montgomery's shares, that's more than enough to push through any major corporate decision. Gregory had turned on his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he accessed legal databases. They've called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow at 9 a.m. Formal notification was sent electronically to all shareholders. He checked the timestamp. Exactly 48 hours ago, fulfilling the minimum notice requirement. Robert sat down heavily, his brain struggling to process the speed with which he was losing everything. Adriana wasn't just retaliating out of personal hurt. She was systematically dismantling his life with surgical precision that spoke of meticulous planning. This hadn't happened in the 3 months since he filed for divorce. This had been carefully planned, every move calculated. Every alliance built before she made her devastating public move at the party. How long had she been planning this? Robert asked aloud, though he didn't expect an answer. How long had Adriana stood by my side, quiet and complacent, while she engineered my destruction? Honestly. Marcus sighed, sinking back into his chair. Probably since the day you first mentioned divorce. Maybe even before, when she realized you were having an affair. Robert remembered those months when his relationship with Rachel had begun. Adriana had never confronted him directly, never made dramatic scenes. She had simply become quieter, more distant. He had interpreted that as acceptance, as evidence that she too had given up on the marriage. Now he realized it had been strategy. While he was distracted by his new passion, Adriana was building alliances, planning moves, transforming herself into something he had never anticipated. Robert's phone rang again. This time, it was a number he recognized. Daniel Huang, CEO of Horizon Technologies, one of Callahan and Associates' largest clients. Robert answered with apprehension. "Daniel, how are you?" "Robert." The voice on the other end was professional but cold. "I'm calling as a courtesy. I received an interesting proposal from Montgomery Properties this morning. They're offering to manage our commercial real estate investments at significantly more competitive rates than your firm currently charges. Given the uncertainty surrounding leadership at Callahan and Associates, we will be re-evaluating our contract." Robert closed his eyes, knowing that call was only the first of many to come. "Daniel, we've worked together for 8 years. You know the quality of our service, our track record of solid returns." "I do, Robert, and I also know Adriana, who developed the analysis reports that convinced me to invest millions through your firm. If she's moving to Montgomery Properties, it makes business sense to follow the talent." A pause. Nothing personal, just business. The call ended before Robert could respond. He looked at Marcus and Gregory, seeing his own defeat reflected in their faces. "She's taking the clients," he said unnecessarily. "Not just the company, but the relationships I spent decades building." Gregory closed his laptop with a soft click that echoed loudly in the silent office. "Mr. Callahan, I need your decision by tomorrow morning before the board meeting. Do you accept the buyout offer and leave with dignity and financial resources intact? Or do you stay and fight a battle that frankly has very low chances of winning? Whatever your choice, I need to know to prepare the appropriate documentation." Robert nodded mechanically, standing to leave. Marcus followed him, his hand firm on Robert's elbow as they navigated the elegant corridors of the law firm to the elevator. Neither of them spoke during the 32-story descent, the silence filled only by the soft hum of the machinery. When they emerged onto the crowded Michigan Avenue sidewalk, The contrast between Robert's internal drama and the normality of the outside world was almost surreal. People rushed past with shopping bags. Tourists snapped photos of the impressive architecture. A street musician played saxophone on a corner. Life went on, oblivious to the fact that Robert Callahan's world was crumbling. "You need to talk to Rachel," Marcus finally said when they reached the car. "Whatever your decision, she needs to be prepared for the consequences." Robert thought of the woman waiting at the hotel, the ring she still wore despite everything, the promises he had made in a moment of blind arrogance. He had destroyed his life and dragged Rachel into the wreckage with him, and now he needed to decide whether he would continue fighting a losing battle or accept defeat and try to rebuild something from the ruins. As Marcus drove through Chicago's evening traffic, Robert looked out the window at the city he had always called home, the city where he had built his empire and now watched it crumble. Adriana had won in every conceivable way, proving that the woman he had discarded was infinitely stronger and more strategic than he had ever imagined. And Robert Callahan, for the first time in his life, had no idea how to proceed. Morning arrived with an unbearable chill, not from the late May temperature, but from the weight of the decision Robert knew he could no longer postpone. He had spent the night awake in the hotel suite, alternating between sifting through financial documents and staring at the ceiling while Rachel slept restlessly beside him. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Adriana's serene face from that devastating night, the impossible transformation of the woman he thought he knew into someone utterly unrecognizable. At 7 in the morning, as the golden light began to spill into the room through the half-opened curtains, Robert finally accepted what his pride had resisted admitting for days. He had lost. Not just the company or the money, but something far more fundamental. He had lost control of the narrative of his own life, and every attempt to reclaim it only plunged him deeper into the hole he himself had dug. Rachel woke to find him already dressed, sitting in the chair near the window with a cup of cold coffee in his hands. She studied him in silence for a long moment before speaking, and Robert noticed how the past few days had left visible marks on her too. The shadows beneath her green eyes were deeper, and there was a tension in her shoulders that wasn't there when he had proposed to her under the crystal chandeliers of the Grand Palais. "You've decided, haven't you?" Her voice was soft, but carried a resignation that cut Robert more deeply than any accusation could have. "I'm going to accept the buyout offer." The words came out before he could reconsider them, solidifying in the air like concrete. $42 million, and I'm out completely. No strings attached, no honorary titles, no pretending I still have any power in the company I built. Rachel got out of bed, wrapping herself in the silk robe she had bought on a shopping spree that seemed like it had happened in another life. She approached, but didn't touch him, maintaining a careful distance that spoke volumes about what the past few days had done to their relationship. "And us?" The question hung between them, laden with all the uncertainties neither of them had dared to confront directly. "What happens to us after you sign those papers?" Robert finally looked at her, truly looked, and saw not the vibrant young woman who had made him feel alive again, but a woman shaken by the storm he had created. The engagement ring still gleamed on her finger, but it looked out of place now, a promise made in a moment of arrogance that no longer existed. "I don't know." The raw honesty of the answer was all he had to offer. "I thought I knew what our life together would be like. A new house, travel, parties where people looked at us with envy. But all of that was built on the assumption that I would be Robert Callahan, the successful businessman, not the man who lost everything to his ex-wife." Rachel closed her eyes, a single tear escaping and tracing a path down her face. When she opened them again, there was something different in her expression, a painful clarity that Robert recognized as the prelude to the end. "I loved you," You know, or at least I loved who I thought you were." She touched the ring absently, turning it on her finger. "The confident man who knew exactly what he wanted, who made me feel special just by being by his side. But that man was built on lies, Robert. Lies about who Adriana was, lies about what you truly controlled, lies about what we could have had together." The truth in those words should have hurt more than it did, but Robert was almost numb from the cascade of losses. A part of him wanted to argue, to defend himself, to insist that his feelings for her were real, even if everything else had been an illusion. But deep down, he knew Rachel was right. The man she had fallen in love with no longer existed, perhaps had never existed outside of his own inflated arrogance. Robert's phone rang, breaking the heavy moment. It was Marcus, his voice tense when Robert answered. "The board meeting has been moved to 8:30. Montgomery wants to settle this before normal business hours. Gregory is already at the office, reviewing the final sale documents." A pause. "Are you sure about this, Robert? Once you sign, there's no turning back." "I'm sure." Robert was surprised by the firmness in his own voice. "Prepare everything. I'll be there in 40 minutes. After he hung up, Rachel had already begun packing her things, folding clothes with mechanical movements that suggested she had made her own decision during the call. Robert watched her in silence, feeling the last anchor of his previous life coming loose. "I'm going to stay with my sister for a while," she said without looking at him. "I need space to think, to figure out who I am outside of all this. And you need time to rebuild your life without using me as a distraction from what really matters." Robert wanted to protest, but he recognized the wisdom in her words. Rachel wasn't cruel, just honest in a way he himself should have been months ago. He nodded silently, and when she finally approached to return the ring, he closed her fingers around the jewelry. "Keep it. Sell it if you need to. Or keep it as a reminder of a time when we were both foolish enough to believe in fairy tales." He forced a sad smile. "I'm sorry for dragging you into this, Rachel. You deserved better." She kissed him softly on the cheek, a farewell gesture that carried as much forgiveness as goodbye, and then left the suite with her small suitcase, leaving Robert alone with the weight of all his disastrous choices. The Callahan and Associates office felt different when Robert entered it for the last time as owner. Employees avoided his gaze, whispering among themselves as he walked down the elegant corridor towards the conference room. Everyone knew what was about to happen. The news had leaked, as it always did in Chicago, and now he walked through a gauntlet of speculation and thinly disguised pity. Marcus waited outside the conference room, holding a leather brief that likely contained the documents that would formalize the end of the Callahan era. His friend seemed to have aged 10 years in a week, deep lines etching his normally jovial face. "They're already inside. Montgomery, Adriana, the lawyers, and the board members who cared enough to show up in person." Marcus hesitated. "Robert, it's still possible to back out. We can try to mount a defense, seek other investors." "No." Robert placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. "It's over, Marcus, and honestly, perhaps it's for the best. I spent so much time building this company that I forgot to build anything else that mattered. My marriage fell apart while I was closing deals. I lost Adriana long before I filed those divorce papers. I just never bothered to notice." Marcus didn't respond, merely opened the door, and Robert stepped into what was once his domain, but now felt like foreign territory. The mahogany and glass conference room was arranged like a courtroom, with Adriana and Alexander seated on one side of the long table, flanked by their lawyers. Gregory was on the other side, and there were empty chairs waiting for Robert and Marcus. Robert forced himself to look directly at Adriana as he took his seat. She was impeccable in a pearl grey suit that accentuated her figure, her hair pulled back in an elegant bun that somehow made her appear both powerful and distant. There was no triumph in her dark eyes when she returned his gaze, just a calm serenity that was somehow worse than any gloating could have been. Alexander spoke first, his deep voice filling the room with natural authority. "Mr. Callahan, I appreciate your presence this morning. I understand you've reached a decision regarding our proposal." Robert accepted the pen Gregory slid towards him, the weight of the instrument disproportionate to its physical size. With that simple tool, he was about to sign his company over to people who had proven to be better strategists than he had ever been. "I accept the terms." His voice didn't tremble, and he was proud of that. That small victory of maintaining composure when everything else had crumbled. $42 million for my remaining shares, complete transfer of all proprietary interests, and resignation from any consulting position or honorary title. I want a clean break. There was movement among the lawyers as documents were organized, pages turned, clauses verified. Robert signed where indicated, his initials appearing on page after page of legalese that effectively erased 25 years of work. The irony was not lost on him, how it took mere minutes to undo what had taken decades to build. When the last signature was completed, Alexander extended his hand across the table. Robert looked at it for a moment before accepting it, the handshake firm and professional, sealing an agreement that transformed enemies into business partners, at least on paper. "I wish you luck in your future endeavors, Mr. Callahan." Alexander's formality was impenetrable, revealing nothing about what he truly thought of the man whose life he had helped dismantle. Then Adriana spoke for the first time, and her voice carried echoes of the woman Robert had known, but with a strength that was entirely new. "Robert, there's something I need to say before we part." She waited until everyone else in the room fell silent, her eyes fixed on the man who had been her husband for 18 years. "I didn't do this for revenge, though I know it seems that way. I did it because I spent too long being invisible, letting my work and my contributions be overshadowed by your name on the door and your presence in boardrooms. When you handed me those divorce papers, it was liberating. Not because our marriage was over, but because I finally had permission to stop pretending I was happy being your shadow." Robert felt each word like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. He recalled countless moments where Adriana had offered ideas and he had presented them as his own, where she had worked late developing strategies and he had taken the credit. She wasn't exaggerating. He had built his empire as much on her back as on his own talent, and he had never bothered to acknowledge it. "You're right," he admitted, and the confession brought a strange relief. "About everything. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry. Not for the divorce or the company, but for all the years where I made you feel like you weren't enough, when in truth, I was the one who was never enough for you." Something flickered across Adriana's face, an emotion too quick for Robert to identify before she recomposed her professional mask. She nodded once, acceptance without forgiveness, and then stood, signaling that the meeting was over. When Robert exited the building that bore his name for the last time, Chicago's morning sun was strong and relentless. Marcus walked beside him in silence to the sidewalk, where they stopped, two middle-aged men facing an uncertain future. "What are you going to do now?" Marcus finally asked. Robert looked up at the windows of the 23rd floor where his old life was unfolding without him, and realized that for the first time in decades he didn't have a ready answer. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I think it's time to figure out who Robert Callahan is when he's not hiding behind corporate titles and achievements that never truly made him happy." 6 months later, Robert was sitting in a modest cafe in Evanston, a northern suburb of Chicago that he had rarely visited during his years of corporate glory. The place was nothing special, just worn wooden tables, a counter where a young barista prepared artisanal coffees, and windows overlooking a quiet street where autumnal leaves danced in the October breeze. It was exactly the kind of place the old Robert Callahan would have considered beneath his status. But the man he was becoming found a strange peace in that simplicity. His laptop was open before him, the screen showing a partially filled document. These weren't financial spreadsheets or business proposals, but something entirely different. In recent weeks, Robert had started writing, initially just as therapy, a way to process everything he had lost and learned. But gradually, those reflections had transformed into something more structured, a book perhaps, about the dangers of blind ambition and the true cost of success when built on fragile foundations. Marcus appeared occasionally, always with that worried look of a friend who wasn't sure if he should ask how he was truly doing. The week before, they had had lunch together, and Marcus had shared that the transition at the company was going surprisingly well. Adriana had implemented changes that increased efficiency, and the merger with Montgomery Properties was generating record profits. The name on the door had changed to Montgomery Callahan Associates, a concession Alexander had made in recognition of the legacy, but everyone knew it was merely cosmetic. The company belonged to Adriana now, in every sense that mattered. Robert found he didn't feel the bitterness he'd expected upon hearing of their success. Perhaps it was because the $42 million provided a comfortable cushion that made it easier to be philosophical about losses. But he suspected it was something deeper. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't defined by external achievements or the validation of others. It was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. The cafe door opened, bringing a gust of cold air and the sound of bells tinkling. Robert looked up distractedly, then froze. Adriana was standing in the doorway, wearing a caramel wool coat over a simple but elegant dress, her hair loose around her shoulders. She saw him immediately, and for a moment they simply stared at each other across the modest space of the cafe. Robert hadn't seen her since that morning in the boardroom, though he thought of her more often than he cared to admit. She looked different again, not the powerful, vengeful woman from the party, nor the subdued wife from their years of marriage, but something in between. There was a softness in her expression that hadn't been present on that devastating day at the Grand Palais Hotel. Adriana approached slowly, and Robert noticed her hands trembled slightly as she tucked them into her coat pockets. "Marcus mentioned you frequent this place," she said when she was close enough to speak without everyone hearing. "I hope you don't mind me coming. There's something I need to say, and it didn't feel appropriate to do it over the phone." Robert gestured to the empty chair opposite him, quickly closing his laptop as if protecting something vulnerable. Adriana sat down, accepting the coffee the barista brought without her having to order, apparently already knowing her preferences. That small detail suggested this wasn't her first visit to the place, and Robert wondered how many times she had been there, perhaps even observing him from afar, before gathering the courage to approach. "Are you well?" Adriana asked, and there was genuine concern in her voice that made something tighten in Robert's chest. "Marcus says you're finding your way, but he doesn't give details." "I'm surviving," Robert replied honestly. "Some days are better than others. Rachel and I officially broke up 3 months ago. She's engaged to a literature professor in Milwaukee. Apparently she's found someone who loves her for who she truly is, not for what she represents." Adriana nodded slowly, her fingers tracing patterns on the coffee cup. "And Alexander and I have postponed the wedding indefinitely." The confession came out softly, but it carried weight. "I found it was easier to plan revenge with him than to build a real future. He's a good man, but we were both using that relationship as a strategic tool, not as something genuine." Robert absorbed that information, feeling a complex mix of emotions he couldn't fully name. It wasn't exactly relief, but perhaps an understanding that they had both been caught in games neither of them truly wanted to play. "You came all this way to tell me that?" he asked gently. Adriana shook her head, finally meeting his eyes with that direct gaze he remembered from the early years of their marriage, before everything became complicated. I came because I need to apologize to you. Not for what I did with the company, that was justice in a convoluted way, but for how I did it, for the public humiliation, for using your moment of joy as a stage for my retaliation. She paused, taking a deep breath. I spent months planning that, convinced that your pain would make me feel better about all my own pain. But it didn't work out that way. When I saw your face that night, when I saw everything collapse for you, I didn't feel victory. I only felt sadness for everything we wasted, for all the years when we could have been honest with each other, but chose not to be. The words hung between them, laden with truths they had both avoided for too long. Robert thought of all the things he wanted to say, all the apologies he had rehearsed in his head during lonely nights. But when he opened his mouth, what came out was simpler and truer than any elaborate speech. I destroyed the best thing I ever had because I was so obsessed with proving something to the world that I forgot to value what truly mattered. You have nothing to apologize for, Adriana. You merely responded to cruelty with intelligence. I deserve every consequence I've faced. Adriana discreetly wiped a tear from the corner of her eye, and Robert realized it was the first time he had seen her cry since everything began. During their marriage, she had become so good at hiding her emotions that he had assumed she simply didn't feel as deeply. Another mistake in a long list of misguided judgments. "What are you writing?" Adriana asked after a moment, gesturing to the closed laptop. "Reflections, I suppose. Trying to understand where everything went wrong, not just with us, but with the person I became." He smiled shyly. "A therapist I started seeing suggested that putting it on paper might help process things. It's strange, going 47 years without knowing there's something you genuinely enjoy doing because you were too busy chasing things you thought you should want. May I read it?" The question was hesitant, as if she wasn't sure she had the right to ask. Robert considered for a moment, then opened the laptop and turned the screen toward her. He watched nervously as Adriana read, her eyes scanning the words he had poured onto the page that morning. They were raw, honest reflections on pride, on how the need for external validation had corroded everything real in his life. When she finished, she closed the laptop gently and pushed it back to him. "It's good, Robert. Honest in a way you never were when we were together." She paused. "You should publish this. Turn it into something that could help other men who are on the path you were on." "Perhaps," Robert admitted. "But first I need to finish understanding it myself." They sat in silence for a while, not uncomfortable, but contemplative. The cafe around them continued its normal routine, college students typing on laptops, an elderly couple sharing a dessert, the barista wiping the counter with efficient movements. It was mundane and perfect, in a way Robert was learning to appreciate. "Are you happy?" Robert finally asked. "Now, without the company as a battlefield, without power games, are you genuinely happy?" Adriana considered the question carefully before answering. "I'm closer than I was. I have professional respect that I never had when I was just Robert Callahan's wife. I have financial independence and autonomy over my own decisions. But happiness—" She shook her head slightly. "I'm still figuring out what that means without being defined in opposition to you or any other man." The raw honesty of that answer touched Robert deeply. They had spent so much time in conflict that it was strange and comforting to simply share truths without defensive armor. "I don't know if there's a way back for us," Robert said slowly, the words forming as he spoke. "Perhaps we've caused too much damage, burned bridges that can't be rebuilt, but I think I'd like to get to know you again, Adriana. Not the woman I projected onto you or the vengeful strategist who destroyed me. The real person sitting here before me. Adriana studied him for a long moment, something soft and careful in her expression. "We can't go back," she finally said. "Different people, in a different place. Perhaps we can start anew, but it has to be honest this time, without games or unrealistic expectations." Just coffee in a modest place and honest conversations?" Robert offered. "Just that," Adriana agreed. When she stood to leave, she offered her hand, and Robert squeezed it, feeling both the familiarity and the strangeness of that touch. She promised to return the following week without commitments or pressures, just two people trying to figure out if there was something real beneath the wreckage of everything they had destroyed. Robert watched her walk out the cafe door, autumn leaves swirling in her wake, and for the first time in months, he felt something that could be hope, not the arrogant hope of his corporate glory days, but something more fragile and precious. The hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the losses they had experienced could teach them how to build something better, truer, on foundations of honesty instead of illusion. And as he opened his laptop again, the words flowed more easily, telling a story of downfall and humility, but also of possibility.